Right, I'm here for another episode of Thorinquiry, my interview series here on my side channel. And my guest for this one is going to be Jon Fitch, who is a veteran of MMA. He fought for many, many years in the UFC. Then he fought in WSOF and obviously Bellator towards the end. Right, Jon, the area I actually want to start this interview with is, I know, like when I discovered MMA, I only knew basic things like, karate and taekwondo exist, and I knew a tiny bit about Brazilian jiu-jitsu because I already knew about people like Joe Rogan. But I have to admit, being from England, I knew nothing about wrestling. Like, I had no idea how important a sport that is in American culture, and especially it turns out in MMA, it's probably the sort of cornerstone sport if you look at the success of people. So one thing I want to ask was, I've heard that is a sport that even when you do it, even if it's just the high school or the college level, is like super brutal. I've heard like it doesn't matter what level you're on, it's just a grind, right?
Yeah. Yes, 100%. I will say, and other wrestlers and fighters will tell you that fighting MMA is way easier, and training for MMA is way easier than wrestling ever was. It was a walk in the park. And you see the importance of wrestling when you're seeing these Russians and guys coming out of Dagestani.
Sure.
And, they just wrestle from a very young age. It's just what they do. And that's what humans, wrestling is the first martial art. It's the first thing we got into was grabbing each other and throwing each other down. Jiu-jitsu is very technique based. Strength does play a role, but it's very technique based. But wrestling, I like to tell people that it's 50% technique and it's 50% balls. And because of that, it can be very brutal. You're basically beating the crap out of each other without kicks and punches every single day for a couple hours during your wrestling season.
I mean, when you say that, like the balls angle, I mean, this is something I want to ask about, which is, it sounds like, the reason I said specifically it's a grind is because when I looked into like even the fact that, because I was shocked, dude, I didn't know that like high school kids are doing weight cuts as well, like UFC style, and that even when you go to the practices and the tournaments, it's just, you're fighting one another, one after, it's not like the UFC, there's a massive layoff. Like, if people don't know, at the regular tournaments in wrestling, right, you fight like 5-6 people, right? You don't just fight one guy, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, hey man, there are like freestyle tournaments and things where you could have a 32-man bracket easily. Man, I think I had close to like 60 guys in a bracket when we did out in Fargo, the junior freestyle nationals. So like, yeah, it's pretty crazy. It can be pretty brutal. And we do wrestlebacks too, and some guys will drop their first match and they get dropped down into the wrestlebacks, and then they've got to wrestle like 6 to 8 matches just to get back into the placing rounds. It can be very brutal.
And then the thing that I was going to ask about was, when you say that, like, I'm assuming mentally is one of the biggest things, right? Like, I know obviously for the sport of MMA, like the technical aspects of wrestling are obviously very important, but it sounds like the main thing that you get out of that sport is you have to be mentally tough, right? Otherwise you won't even get through, like we're talking about the high school level, you just quit, right?
You will not get through practice. If you are not mentally tough, you will not get through practice. People break down regularly. It is part of a coach's job to break his athletes. Even if you're the best wrestler in the room, that coach has to figure out a way to wear you out so that you're getting your ass kicked part of the time.
And how do you deal with that? Like, I mean, like, if what we're talking about here is, it's not like the idea of like, will you break? Eventually you're going to, right? It's just at some point in time, it's going to be too much.
It's not about when, it's not about if you will, it's when. And when you do, how will you recover? How will you react?
Do you think that's changed your mentality, not just on fighting, but like life itself, how you react to challenges and things that come along, times you lose?
Most definitely. If you want somebody, you want your kids not to be somebody who has a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear, and you want them just to be a little tougher, like make them wrestle. They're not going to like it for a while, but they're going to get stronger. They're going to be better for it.
This will sound like
there's
a weird.
There's just no shortcuts. There's just no shortcuts. There's always somebody who's a little bit faster, a little bit stronger. The thing that levels the playing field is your how hard you work. How hard are you willing to work for it? How much are you going to push?
When I did a little bit of jiu-jitsu just as a fun thing on the side as a hobby when I've started watching MMA. And one thing I would say is, like, I was also amazed in that sport about essentially how bad you are when you begin and how everyone, it doesn't matter, you might think, well, that person doesn't look that big. Like, everyone can ragdoll you when you've got any training. So what I wanted to ask was this. My actual job field is in video games, a video games tournament, so very much not a physical dimension. But one thing I'll say about that space is the old school video games like Quake, which were like hardcore, like 1v1 games, and it was like really difficult. It was almost like a video game type version of chess. You know, you had to be like very good at these games. One of the things that used to put people off them, believe it or not, and made them actually not that popular as like modern day video games are, is that it was too tough. And the vibe was when you would play it, everyone who played you would just beat you by so much it would put you off playing because you think like, oh, what the hell, they're that much better than me. So what I found was, you'll see where I'm going with this. I found that essentially the enjoyment you get out of one of those games isn't every time you play it. You're not winning every time. It's like delayed gratification. What you have to focus on is this. When you first start, it sucks so much that even the guy a tiny bit better than you beats you. So what you've got to think is, I want to be at the position he's at, so then I can do this to the guy behind me in the line. So like when I fight the guy who's up and coming, then I dominate him. And essentially, it sounds weird because it's sort of a mental grind, but you're not doing it just for like raw fun of having in this case, a fight, playing a match. It's like part of it's sort of like you're thinking of, I mean, you're trying to improve as a human almost, right?
Yeah, I mean, facing adversity, leveling up. And I think, man, we've kind of lost a lot of that as a culture, I think, at least here in the States. I mean, and using video games as a reference, like back when I played video games, like you'd play for 2 hours in a game and then you died and everything was gone.
Yes.
There was no like save button. I remember when that revelation came around where, you know, you could save every 30 seconds and keep going forward, and you keep dying. And, you know, I could see from a business angle where they kept people buying the games, kept people playing because anybody could do it. But there's definitely something lost on the difficulty scale. Yes. You know, and I'm not blaming this particular thing. I think it's happened to a lot of things, but in society in general seems to be very soft and not very capable of handling tough situations.
Sure. I mean, along those lines, what I would ask you is this might sound like a weird question, but I think it's just fun to ask interesting questions. Here's what I would ask you is, one of the things I've always been amazed about in UFC, like I'll give you an example. I once did a separate show where someone said, like, as a hypothetical, you know, like, what sport would you want to be like the best in or whatever? And my joke was like, well, obviously definitely not MMA, because even if you're the champion, you get beaten up. Like, people punch you, you might get choked out, you might get knocked out. Like, essentially what I would ask is this, is there a point when you've been fighting for long enough where, like, can you sort of in your brain turn off the part that's telling me, like, I'm getting hit now, or react to that? Does that eventually just go away? Does it just become background noise? How do you handle it?
No, the fear of fighting, it never goes. It never diminishes. It's always there. The thing is that you understand that it's there and what risks are there, and you just do it. You know, you're like, I know this is probably going to hurt. But you're prepared, you're trained to mitigate those risks. You get hit less if you're prepared and you know what you're doing. There's less damage that's going to happen, but there's still that risk that something bad can happen. I like to use the example. I've never done skydiving, but I would imagine the feeling before a fight is similar to the feeling you're standing on that doorway of the plane with your pack on, right? And you're ready to jump out with your chute on your back. Because you know you're going to do it. You got to do it. You know what it's going to feel like. It's going to be scary no matter what you do. The only difference with MMA is, though, when you jump out of that plane, it's like you're jumping out into like a forest, and you're going to land. You're going to go through a bunch of branches, and there's a good chance you're going to hit a lot of branches on the way down. But you just have to be prepared. Like, this is going to happen. I know I'm going to get hit in the face, but I don't care. I'm going to bite down my mouthpiece and I'm going to move forward.
One thing I feel like must be the most underestimated aspect of MMA from watching it for so many years is it feels like the fan at home can never understand the concept of how physically exhausting, like especially a title fight, can be. Like, in their mind, I mean, you've heard of the million lines. Like, they all think like, oh, but I've got too much heart. You know, I wouldn't like stare down. You know, all the shit.
Close my eyes.
I know exactly,
bro.
Yeah, basically, like, how would you explain that? Like, if people don't know, especially the 5-round fights are almost designed to be impossible to go full pace, right?
It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. People don't know they know so little about fighting. They don't understand how much they don't know about fighting.
Right.
People just don't get it. Like, why doesn't he just stand up? How come he just doesn't get up? They don't understand. Like the rest of you have not been around wrestling. If you haven't tried wrestling before,
yes,
you have no concept of what it feels like to have somebody throw you down on the ground and then you have to fight your way back up to your feet. How much energy that takes. You know, you do that one time, and most people don't have enough gas left in the tank to throw a punch. They're just breathing heavy. You know, yeah, people really don't know. I teach MMA, jiu-jitsu, wrestling stuff now, but I also put a big focus on self-defense. And I think people need self-defense. They need some kind of practical fight training because it's getting a little bit rougher out there. And the confidence you build when you understand how to handle somebody, when you know how to handle yourself in certain situations, everybody needs today, I think, big time. So,
yeah, go on, keep going.
Yeah, I just think that once they start getting put in certain positions, they start feeling what it's like. You see a lot of like light bulbs go off, and it's wild to see the metamorphosis people take because one, people have no idea what their capabilities are, and two, they have no idea what their restrictions are. You know, and those two factors, that's scary going out into the world and somebody gets in your face or somebody tries to pick a fight with you, you know, because maybe you have devastating KO power and you don't know, and you hit somebody, you kill them. Well, now out of fear and not knowing how to mitigate your response, you're in trouble. You're getting big trouble, even if you got attacked, you know? Or some people think, oh, well, you know, I had worked in the bars for a long time. I had a waitress who I remember, it was late at night and it was a rough night kind of. And I was like, hey, you need to walk you the car. She's like, oh, no. I know I look small. She was like 110 pounds. She's like, I know I look small, but when I get mad, you know, watch out. And I was just like, whatever. You're crazy. You're a crazy person.
Sure.
You know, like it was like 50 yards. Like, I'm not trying to get in your pants. I'm just trying to make sure you don't get beat up in the parking lot. And just disconnect with what a person's limitations are. Even if she was well-trained in a black belt. Like, I've seen highly trained women who are black belts still get thrown around by large men who don't have much training.
Sure.
Just because muscle does matter. Size does matter. Bone density matters.
Yes.
You know, and if you don't understand those limitations, like even for me, you know, I'm 225 pounds right now. Like I went back, you know, I stopped in at AKA to train a little while ago. Well, I guess it was like almost last Christmas, and I'm rolling around with heavyweights, you know, and there were some guys there who were like 280, 265, and just moving with those guys. Like, I've been a black belt since 2008. I've wrestled at a high level. Like, I've been world champion, 4-time world champion. And these guys, they're undercard fighters. People don't know who they are, you know, but I'm still struggling just because that size difference, 30, 40, 50 pounds, that's a big deal, man. That's a big deal in a fight.
Yes. I mean, if people don't know, that was another thing. Because as I say, my background is like the type of wrestling you guys do in America is just not a thing in England, basically. Like, we have a different sporting background. And the thing I would say is, like every naive fan, because I didn't understand wrestling, I used to think all the same things that everyone says now, like, why do they do the weight classes like that? You know, why don't they all like just go at their normal weight? And what I didn't realize is essentially comes from wrestling, right? Any amount of weight you can have over that guy, if you can cut more. I mean, wrestling is the ultimate sport, right? To be bigger, stronger, be able to overpower the person. As you say, but in jiu-jitsu, almost builds itself the opposite way. Like, you know, the smaller guy with more technique coming. But in wrestling, like, let's be real, it's reality, right? I mean, I can see why it's led you, actually, by the way, into some of the sort of political areas you're in. Because if someone's doing a sport like wrestling, you can't be in denial of reality. You can't think, like you say, that because you saw a movie and some girl in it did all kung fu moves, you can't really think that she's going to beat a guy who's 50 pounds heavier. Like, his advantage is just inherent, right?
Yeah, it was just get out of here. You know, like, I've seen it. I've seen the reality. What people's theories are don't play out. And when you're forced into a wrestling situation, you understand, like, technique is great. And, you know, it's superior to have good technique and no technique and be able to perform that technique. But size does matter. Strength does matter. You know, even with jiu-jitsu today, you know, I posted a meme of my Instagram a little while ago, and it's like, the top says, jiu-jitsu guys say, you know, strength doesn't matter. And then it's a picture of a guy shooting steroids in his arm.
Sure.
there's no like regulation in that sport today. And there's some monsters walking around those mats. And, You know, a lot of those guys at the top are not clean, and it matters. If they had the same technique, same abilities, without that stuff, they're not going to place as high against the guys who are dirty, just because strength matters, testosterone level matters.
When you first started doing wrestling before you became like an actual professional fighter, were you already in your mind a tough guy? Were you already become that? Were you always someone like that?
That was like the thing that kind of pushed me into wrestling. Was like that was the guys I always respected, the tough guys, the big strong guys. You know, maybe it's because I grew up in the 80s watching Schwarzenegger and Stallone and Bloodsport and all that type of stuff. You know, I was a fan of the early pro wrestling, Hulk Hogan, Junkyard Dog, Jimmy the Fly Snuka, those guys. I was a big fan. But then in the 4th grade, I went to a real wrestling practice and I realized that stuff was all fake, and I couldn't believe it. I haven't watched wrestling since. I lost a lot of respect for it because I was like, oh, these guys lied to me. I thought they were really tough guys, but they were just actors. So, you know, I started on that path of wrestling, and I always, you know, played wrestling and football were my big sports, and that was because they were tough sports. You had to like bite down and go, and I always respected that because there was something to that because I could see that not everybody was capable of making that decision to just be tough. I'm going to be tough because it's not like a natural born thing. I don't think. I think it's learned behavior and it's a choice. Like I never saw my father complain about stuff. He just didn't, you know, whether things went wrong, whether his fault or not, he didn't complain. The most he ever said was, shit. And then he would take care of it, whatever it was. And I think that was just a level of toughness that I respected and I looked for in other people too, because it was rare. And the older I get, the more rare it seems, you know, and the more important I think it is that we return to that a little bit.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, man. Let's lean into that a little bit, because one thing I would say is I see the exact example you're giving is often misportrayed in the world, because it's how in the modern day they actually soften people up. What they'll say is oh, what men should do is they shouldn't be like that, John. What they should do is they should be totally open and tell everyone their fears and insecurities and their doubts. And like, look, I can understand from certain people's perspective why they think that's legit. But what I would say is this, right? Look, obviously you can go too far and maybe you can become too closed off and all the rest of it. But I would say there's a time and a place for these things, you know. And sometimes in the case you're talking about, if you're like the leader of a family, like a father, maybe you're actually doing the other members of that family a favor by not burdening them with all your thoughts and your fears. And maybe you're even letting them think someone's taking charge of things, right? Someone's got it under control.
You want to turn your girlfriend off. You want to turn your wife away quickly. Start telling her about all your problems. Seriously. I've never heard that go well for any man. The women want to respect you. And if you're complaining about the stuff that's hard in your life all the time, they're not going to respect you. That's just the way it is. I don't make the rules, but I can see that happen. It plays out over and over and over again. Like you have to have a mind of like, oh, well, this stuff happened. Now I've got to take care of it. And that's it. You're not allowed. It's not that you're not allowed, but like, it doesn't do you any good as a man to like sit around and cry about it. You know, you have to understand the things that you can change and the things that you can't change and accept them. And you have people depending on you to make those things happen. Like, I don't know how to get that through to some people. I think a lot of people who do get really emotional. I mean, we have a problem with people's testosterone levels and health these days. For sure. Yeah. You know, and when your testosterone levels drop below a certain point, you start getting really emotional and you start becoming more feminine with your actions and you start acting out. That's not like a case of, oh, I need to get into touch with my emotions and my traumas or whatever. It's like life is trauma. Everything is trauma. The second you were born, right, your birth is a trauma. And it's probably the greatest trauma you ever experienced because it was the first and most. You're floating around in a warm, fuzzy, warm, awesome place. Your food and oxygen, everything's supplied for you. It's awesome. And then you get squeezed out of a tiny hole. You know, screaming, doctor smacks you on the ass. That's traumatic. Like, life is traumatic. If you're not willing to suck it up and go to work, like your whole life is going to be traumatic for the rest of your life.
This might sound like a weird question, but let me phrase it this way, right? It sounds like this mentality of how you grind to be a wrestler and to be part of these sports also applies to the other aspects. Because one thing I want to ask, again, I'm a total amateur, so I'd love to know what your take on this, right? I actually noticed that the people who did go through the wrestling background not only have a very good mentality for fighting in MMA, but the question I have is this: is there a lot of cheating in amateur wrestling? Because I get the vibe that like people are going to get away with stuff anyway, and you just got to take the result, right? There's going to be some fuckery anyway. Is that accurate?
I've never really experienced successful cheaters in wrestling. You know, I've never come across that. I'm sure there is somewhere, especially nowadays. You know, since 2010. I
don't mean so much like steroids. I mean more like, you know, like trying to like do like an illegal hold when the ref doesn't look, or get away with some on top of an angle or something. Is there much of that goes on?
No, not really at all. I can't really think out to any time in my past where it was like a dirty team who did dirty stuff.
Okay.
You know, usually the most intimidating, the toughest teams are the ones who shoved the rules down your throat. The ones that played by the rules were so tough, you know, they almost push other guys into cheating, you know, or breaking the rules. It's really not. It's always been a very like honorable, straightforward type sport, you know.
No, fair enough. Right. When you actually were finished with your high school wrestling career and doing college and stuff, right, one thing I've noticed is really strange about MMA is even though people who come from a wrestling background, often in like the match trash talk, try to make that sound like that matters. Like obviously someone like Daniel Cormier was at the Olympics, you know, like people know the different levels you could be at. But I've noticed in MMA, it feels like it's very up and down as to whether like your actual wrestling background matters that much. What would you say to that? And like, for example, could you tell from your own career in wrestling, like this will help me in MMA, like I'll be a good MMA fighter? What's the
It definitely
transition?
helps a lot. The problem with MMA today is the monopoly the UFC holds, and the fact that we have no independent titles, we have no independent ranking. It puts all the power in the hands of the promoters, and the promoters control the promotional ranks, and they control ascension to the title. So it's not really a sport. It doesn't operate as a sport. The fights are real, right? But you would call them promotional exhibitions, not a sport, because the fighters don't own their ranks. They can't climb the ladder because they're good, right? It's kind of like a production with a television show or a reality show. The promoters get to pick who gets the spotlight. The promoters get to pick who gets pushed forward, because all they care about is eyeballs. All they care about is popularity. They just want to make money. They don't care about, you know, the upholding the you know, rigorous whatever standards of sport at all. They don't care. And, you know, if you're a great wrestler, but you don't talk great on the mic, there's a good chance they're not going to give you much of a push at all.
Yes. I mean, this is obviously a topic we're definitely going to explore in a minute or two, so I'll set it up. So when you first came to the UFC, you had an amazing streak of fights that you'd won in a row, including before you joined the UFC, and then obviously it got you to the fight with Jon St. Pierre for the title, right? When you actually started out at MMA and you were on this run of winning fights, did you actually have a sense, like, I might be the best fighter in my weight class? Did you think that?
I mean, that was my goal to do it. Like I graduated from Purdue University 2002, and then I had won a scholarship for a year of grad school that was paid. So I had room and board and my school paid for. So I was like, I got a coast year. I got to stick around Purdue and help as an assistant coach, a volunteer assistant with the wrestling team. So I was in the wrestling room working with guys still. And the MMA thing kind of popped up. One of my coaches was the assistant coach, Tom Erickson. He had been fighting in Pride. He had some fights in Brazil and stuff like that. And he kind of introduced me to some other fighters like Gary Goodridge and Mark Coleman. And those guys would come into Purdue and work out sometimes. And I started training with them a little bit. And they started telling me stories about them traveling around the world and fighting people and the money they were making. And it sounded like a lot of fun. It sounded a lot more fun than teaching, because that was what my degree was going to be. And I was going to go be a teacher. Once my grad school year was over, I was going to go be a teacher, and that was going to be my life. And I wanted to try something new. So I decided to try fighting, and I had Tom find a fight for me. My first fight, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea I didn't spar at all for it. I trained a little bit with Gary Hildmitz for me. And then I wrestled around with some people that we found around Purdue that were interested in MMA. Some of the judo guys, we'd work on groundwork stuff, but I had no idea what I was doing. I lost my first fight, and I was just kind of like, what am I doing? Like, if I'm going to do this, like, I can't half-ass this. And then I'd met somebody at that first time, Brian Ebersol, and he was in Eastern Illinois, so he was only a couple hours away. So we started training a little bit together and talking, and he started fighting some more fights. And I started winning some fights and doing okay. And I was like, hey, man, I might actually be able to do something with this. And then I found AKA, came out for a week to train at AKA to just kind of see what it was like out here, because there was nothing back in Indiana when I was training at the time. And it was a great experience. I saw there was a ton of coaches to work with, a ton of people to work with. And even if things didn't work out at AKA, there was in the Bay Area in California, there was a ton of other gyms and jiu-jitsu and places to go. So I was like, all right, that's what I got to do. I got to move. So I fought again. I lost. I took a fight on 2 weeks' notice. You can find me, Jon Fitch versus Wilson Govea. And so it was like at 205. And it was a crazy fight. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was throwing crazy punches. And I ended up running into a knee off a shot and get knocked out. And after that, I was like, yeah, man, I can't stay in Indiana if I'm going to do this. And I made plans to move to California once my year of grad school was up. And at that time period, I really decided just to buckle down and commit myself to fighting and being the absolute best I could. Like that was going to be my mission in life. I kept a journal at the time too. I actually have a book out called Failing Upwards or Death by Ego. And that's available on Amazon. But that's my journals, entries, and reflections I wrote off of that first year or so, year and a half. I think I was in California as I moved out there. And yeah, it was just like my martial arts journey was just like, I wanted to be the number one guy to do it ever. That was my goal.
Right. When you got to the title fight against GSP, for fans at home who don't know, this is quite early on actually in both of your careers. Like this is where, like I say, you'd had like, I think 8 fights or something at the UFC. This is where GSP had just come back and beaten Matt Serra in the return fight and become the champion, etc. Right. When you had this fight, one of the things in your career, obviously that looks a bit bad now when you look back, is like, this is early on. So you'd think, right, it doesn't matter if you lose a title fight now, there's going to be other chances, but this ends up being basically like the biggest fight of your career. Right. So at that time, were you ready for it?
I was ready for it. I think one of the things that was off with that fight was because he had lost to Matt Serra not that long before. You know, he got knocked out, one punch knocked out by Matt Serra, and then he came back to beat Matt Serra. But I still had that in my head that his chin was not there.
Right.
So part of my thinking in that fight was if I just got to touch him once, if I can just get inside, and I abandoned my normal fighting strategy, where normally I would punch and work my way inside to clinch and then work for takedowns. But I didn't really do that fight. I was throwing a lot more punches and kicks, and my defense was not where it needed to be able to do that. And then early on, I threw a bad leg kick and I got caught with a hard right hand, and that put me on skates.
Right.
The rest of the fight. That one punch, I think, broke my orbital, and then I was seeing double most of the rest of the fight, the next 4 rounds. And I still was coming at him hard the whole fight, but I think just strategy-wise, I made the wrong decision.
Right. Obviously, in that fight, if people watch it, he got like a whole bunch of takedowns, was able to hold you down a lot of the fight, right? At the time, and this obviously
he wasn't able to keep me on the ground much. It was mostly a stand-up fight. The one of the times, he took me down like twice, but he knocked me down a couple times,
One thing I wanted to ask was, obviously the famous thing about GSP is he's not someone that has an amazing wrestling background, and he wasn't one of these people who's like a college champion and sport, but everyone says in MMA his wrestling's very good. Is there something unique about him? Is he stronger? What would you say his secret is?
The thing that people argue with me all the time with is people who know nothing about fighting and have never done it before. It's not that GSP's wrestling was top notch. And people get mad at me when I say this, but I don't think he would have been an All-American. I don't think he would have been on a national team. I don't think he had that type of skill set to be able to wrestle at those levels. Right? I'm not saying he's bad, but what I'm saying is his timing, the techniques that he was able to use and perform were excellent with his timing. And he was able to do that because his striking was good. He was fast. He was good striking. and explosive. So he would make you pause. He would shuffle step. He would throw something. He would feint something, and then he would be able to change levels and get in on a shot when you are off balance. And MMA wrestling is way easier than traditional collegiate or freestyle wrestling because you're standing up. Your guard's in a different position. And if you can make guys worried about the stand up, the wrestling becomes way easier, and vice versa. You know, the second time I fought Thiago Alves, I outstruck him. I was a better kickboxer than he was that fight because he was so worried about the takedown.
Yes.
That's one of the elements that a lot of these guys miss by not focusing or adapting the wrestling aspects into their game. Is you can freeze a guy. You can take him out of his element by threatening the takedown every once in a while.
Yes. I mean, actually, this ties in perfectly to a question I want to ask you about this first GSP fight, which was, since, as you say there, you had it in your head, like, you know, maybe has a weak chin, maybe if I can touch him once, that's the game changer. Do you think that means that, like, other people not knowing that took the wrong, like, conclusion from that fight? Because, I mean, you'll know this, the conclusion people took was GSP and Jon Fitch have similar strengths, so GSP is just slightly better, and so he'll just win. You know, that was what people thought, right?
Yeah, because people don't really understand what they're seeing, you know, and they don't even ask questions. I don't think the announcers help with any of that, you know, because there's plenty of times, you know, Israel Adesanya just lost a big fight, and he's mostly a striker, and I don't think he has much wrestling or wrestling defense, but he doesn't fight anybody who tries to take him down. Every time he fights somebody, even if they have wrestling, they don't bother trying to take him down. Like, I don't understand why. I don't know if they're incentivized, which they could be. They might be incentivized by the promotion to keep it standing. They may give them bonuses to change their fighting style.
Okay.
You know, there's 100% chance that type of thing does happen one way or another. You know, we want an exciting fight. Make sure the fight's exciting. That's code word from the promoters to keep it standing. You know, and like, if you make this fight exciting, you're going to get taken care of. Don't worry. And they've used that language before. Yes. It's all code work, all code speak, but we know what they mean.
Absolutely. I mean, along those lines, like, this obviously leads into the topic that you sort of alluded to before, so let's talk about it. So after this, you then had 5 straight wins, including, and I remember this, dude, this is one of the reasons I want to do this interview with you. I remember that fight you had, which was the rematch against Thiago Alves. Dude, Dana White himself said in the press conference, like, this is like a title eliminator. So basically, whoever wins the fight gets the next title shot. But because it was a mixture, because Thiago Alves unfortunately missed weight, so the fight wasn't like the standard one classified. And then secondly, let's be real, it's because you won. Like, when he said that, let's be real, he wanted Thiago Alves to win, and he thought, right, well, that's someone who could potentially make an exciting fight against GSP, right? He didn't really want you to win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, 100%. And then that was a great performance. I had a great performance. It was a great fight, and you can't tell me otherwise. I fought my ass off, and it was exciting. I went for submissions. I tried takedowns. I outstruck him. It was a good fight all around. But they're mad because I didn't finish him. I mean, it's Thiago Alves. How many people finished the guy at the time?
Sure.
It was just silly, and they didn't like me, and I talked back with them. They were trying to get me to fight Koscheck, but I was like, you know, if it's not for a title, like, we're not breaking up our team just for you guys. And that's one of the strategies that they do too. The promoters try to break up teams. They try to pull fighters away from their managers. This is what they've kind of sealed all that stuff up now, but pull guys away from their managers. If you've had a good manager actually fought for you, they would do what they could to try to get rid of that guy. Because they started monopolizing the sport around the 2010 time when they had the Strike Force deal, and they started buying Pride and WEC and other competition.
Was the perception, like, put it this way, did they ever tell you straight up privately, like, it's just your style of fighting? Because that's what it was, right? I mean, some of it, might be like disagreeing with the management, but the perception at the time was like wrestling's boring, right? They want people that are knocking people out. That's
on them. That's what they push. Because I'm telling you, we just had the ADCC, right? The Abu Dhabi Combat Challenge, right? Gordon Ryan and Filo competing. Like, they're in a stadium. These guys are competing in a stadium. People are in a 20,000 seat full stadium, and they're watching submission wrestling. So the idea that people don't like fighting on the ground is horseshit. And the fact that my style was no different than GSP's. It was no different. Like, we both struck a little bit. We both worked to the clinch and grappled and beat you up on the ground and ground and pounded. There's no problem with that. One issue that did slow a lot of fights down and made things harder for me to finish was in Around 2009, 2010, they started changing things with the stand-up. Before, if you got taken down, you were down until you submitted, swept, or stood up yourself. But once the UFC started pushing more towards entertainment, they started having the ref jump in and standing guys up. When that happened, the guy on bottom started to close his guard and hold the guy.
Yes.
So the guy on bottom would just hug. He would just hug, hold on to hands, hold on to you. He would stop the fight. Because if he could stop the fight enough, the ref would stand you up. To me, that's stalling. Hey, that's stalling.
Sure.
You're not fighting from bottom at that point anymore. If you're boxing with somebody and you're throwing punches and you keep pushing into the clinch and clinching and stopping the fight, after a while, they're going to warn you and take a point away. But in MMA, you get rewarded. You get a positional reward. So that became, a real thorn in my ass, because now guys didn't have to fight anymore. The strikers could just coast on their back. They didn't have to learn jiu-jitsu. They didn't have to learn the techniques to get up anymore. All they had to do was learn how to stall, and they got rewarded.
I saw that actually, instead of you fighting against GSP, it actually was Koscheck who got the next fight, and they did the rematch in his case. Like, obviously, there's the personal connection for you there. But what I would ask is this. Do you think that just confirms, as you say, that it's also about like how you market yourself? Because obviously, look, Koscheck himself has a background as a wrestler, but he was good on the mic. Like, he knew how to trash talk and make people hate him like a villain. Do you think that was part of why he got the fight and you didn't?
Yeah, he was a great heel. He was a great heel. And like I said before, like the way their structure is it makes it more of a production. When you have a production, it's like a movie. Well, you can't cast the two same characters.
Yes.
You can't have two Hulk Hogans. Who's going to watch two Hulk Hogans fight? You have to have one turn bad. You have to have a heel. Well, they already had a GSP, so they didn't need me. They didn't need the American version of GSP. They already had the Canadian version, right?
Yes.
They needed somebody else. If I would have pulled Chael Sonnen, if I would have pulled a Cody Covington, then it would have been different. If I would have decided to play into that pro wrestling type stuff to sell myself. But I was hard nosed and fighting against that because I hate that crap. I wanted it to be a sport, right? Your skills should be what takes you forward. Your ability to win, your ability to perform, that should be what builds your notoriety and that pushes you forward. And, I probably cost myself tens of millions of dollars by not playing that game. But I don't know, man. It feels like selling out. It feels like bastardizing something I love. I wasn't going to do it.
You said earlier, like, about the angle on GSP with the UFC as well. I actually also agree, by the way. Like, I always got the vibe. If GSP wasn't so insanely popular in Canada and such a massive box office draw, just his style of how he fought those title fights, dude, the UFC would cut someone like that. Like, they don't like that type of fighter. They don't want decisions every time. That's just the message they've sort of sent, right? The problem is he just was killing it in the box office.
Yeah, people loved him. Canada loved him. He had a whole country behind him. Right time, right place. He's a great personality.
For sure.
Speaks multiple languages. He's a good sell. Like he's an easy sell.
Obviously, the fight never happened, but just give me your thoughts. Like, I'm sure you were thinking at times when you watched him fight, what would I do if I fought him again? You're obviously building towards it at this point. Like I said, going for the title shot. What would you have tried to do differently if you fought a second time, do you think?
No, I definitely would have put more effort into punching to clinch, fighting my way into clinch. I tightened up my defense over the years, keeping my hands up, fixing my head movement. I think, getting him in the fence and pushing him into the fence and doing a lot more clinch work and neck wrestling type stuff, make him really work in those positions. I think that would have been a big change in the result of that fight.
One thing I'd love to ask you, because one area that wrestlers sometimes perceive to get the advantage in MMA, especially with like UFC type rules, is with the takedowns and how they're scored. So in light of what you were saying earlier about like the difference between taking someone down and holding them down, etc., right? If you have a fight where someone just scores takedowns, but the other person gets straight up. So I think like a classic example of this actually was when Chael Sonnen beat Michael Bisping. I think it was exactly that. He just took him down a couple of times. Michael Bisping got straight back up because he had good cardio. But at the end, Chael Sonnen just won essentially because he had takedowns. And like they just judged it, I guess, as like octagon control or something, right? How much do you think of that type of wrestling should score heavily? Do you think you should have to be doing damage? You have to control them in some way? What's your take on that?
Well, so the word damage is a difficult word to use because it's not a static where everybody sees it differently. Everybody sees damage differently. There was a fight a few UFCs ago where one guy was throwing punches and the other guy, was kind of just not affected by them, but he was returning leg kicks, and it seemed like the leg kicks were doing way more damage. I'm using air quotes, damage. Yes. In the fight, it's to the point where the guy who was throwing the punches was limping, had to change his stance up. Like he had to change the way he was fighting because of what was happening to his legs from the leg kicks. They ended up giving the fight to the guy who was throwing the punches. But in my opinion, he didn't do the damage the other guy did. So they use that word damage around, but really what they mean, it's code word. They really mean exciting.
Yes.
They really mean exciting. The guy who did the most exciting stuff should win. And it has nothing to do with sport to me. It has nothing to do with sport. The rules, they changed the rules in 2017. The rules are actually, it's the technique that moves the fight along closer to the finish, something along that lines, right? The technique that gets the fight closer to ending the fight, that one. So if you hit a double leg and take the guy down to the mat versus you hit a double leg and you slam him to the ground like Matt Hughes and what's his name that long time ago, right? The slam, right? You could possibly knock him out with the slam takedown. So that should score higher in those regards in that scoring system, if that makes sense. But to me, it's still a little wishy-washy, the rules should be clear cut. We don't have a clear cut criteria in scoring. And that's a major problem, I think. And that's a problem I think favors the promoter. Like I have a bunch of board games at the house, right? My kids can read the rules. They can read the criteria of how the game is played and how the game is scored. And we can play that game correctly every single time. The criteria in MMA scoring should be similar.
Sure. We
should be able to take somebody off the street, have them read the criteria of how to score the fight, watch a fight, and do it correctly most of the time. 95%, 99% of the time, I believe. I've taught, my degree was in PE, so I had to teach lacrosse and tennis and sports that I'd never played before. Well, guess what? I can read the rules, can read the criteria on scoring and how the game is played and how the game is won. And I can teach that to other people, and they can do that and they can play the game right. That should be across the board the same with MMA. You don't see as many messed up scores in boxing as you do in MMA. And it's why? Like, I feel like they're not really trying to fix that problem, because I think when mistakes happen and guys lose fights, I think it helps the promoter out, because they don't like guys who win a lot.
Yes.
They would rather guys win some and drop some, because that keeps their pay lower, because you only get pay bumps when you win. And it keeps their leverage down, because if you don't just keep winning and winning and winning, you don't have as much leverage. Like Khabib Nurmagomedov has had the most leverage out of any fighter that they ever had. And that's why they kind of hate him.
Sure. I mean, along these lines, I mean, the fight right after this that he had against BJ Penn's a perfect example of how weird MMA scoring is, right? Because in this fight, if people don't know, because obviously it goes based on rounds, right? He gets the first 2 rounds by doing exactly what I'm talking about. He just does takedowns that you get up from, or he just hangs on your back and tries to go for like submissions that don't land, basically. But in the 3rd round, mate, you fucking put the work on him in this fight. Like, fair play to BJ, he even admits it in the interview. Yeah, he basically even admits like he lost the fight, right? Like in this scenario, if a fight is an entire entity, like, put it this way, the old adage people say, like, if someone does a submission, if the ref isn't there, you'd be dead, right? In this scenario, if this was a real fight, he's not winning it. Like, it's over. He's just getting manhandled, right?
Yeah. And the scorecards too was like, it was 2 judges scored it 2 rounds to 1, 10-9, 10-9, BJ Penn the first 2 rounds, 10-8 me. So that's a tie. The 3rd judge scored the first round for Penn and the next 2 for me. And the 3rd round was a 10-8. So like overall on the score, I won.
Yes.
Like, I don't know. I still don't understand that at all. Why that was a draw. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. Like, if you go by the points,
yes,
I won based off of more judges. More judges thought I won. 2 judges thought it was a tie. 1 judge thought I won. To me, I won. I don't see that. That doesn't even make sense to me.
Sure. By the way,
They said majority draw. Because
what did you even think of that fight, by the way? Because I've always thought that's like an example of where like BJ Penn must have been crazy. Why was he fighting guys way bigger than him?
In that fight. My head wasn't in that fight because they just rugged me. You know, they rugged me about the title fight. I was supposed to fight GSP, and they pulled this out. I started losing my mind. Like, I was looking for a shortcut. I was looking to make some answers. So I went vegan. I went vegan before that fight because I thought that's the thing that's going to put me over the edge. And that's, you know, that was a huge mistake. I lost like 10 pounds of muscle. I lost my horsepower. And then the way they just did a bunch of like passive aggressive stuff to me, the whole camp, the whole whatever. You know, when we did interviews and press tours and stuff, it was always like the worst room, worst flight. I always got attitude from everybody. It just, I'm sorry, like I should have handled it better, but it gets to you when like you feel like the promotion is against you and working against you. That's not a fun feeling. And walking out to the fight, I remember they like screwed up the timing on my walkout music. And I was like, I knew they did that on purpose too. Like they always do this little passive aggressive stuff just to mess with you. And I knew they were doing it. So that first round, I was completely flat. I didn't even wake up. And then I thought I won 2 and 3. I won rounds 2 and 3. I did more air quotes damage. I did more work. I nullified whatever takedowns he got. You know, I fought through positions. And then third round, I just destroyed him. And that fight was supposed to be a 5-round fight too, because they'd switched to 5-round. They just made a huge announcement about all fights from now on in the final, you know, the final main event fight.
Yes.
5-round main events. Then they came back and said, oh, wait, after the BJ Penn fight.
Would have obviously been massive advantage to you, right?
There was no way he was going to make 5 rounds with me. They knew it. So like they had all this stuff piling up, and it's my fault, 100% my fault for letting it get to me, but it got to me. They got to me. They got under my skin, and they altered the course of that fight because they got under my skin.
There was also the vibe, like, let's be real, like what you were saying earlier about the way the sport works. Like, if anyone doesn't know as well, the other reason why the UFC doesn't want people to win all the fights is you need to use the big name fighters to build up your other name fighters. So I'm sure in this case, they wanted you to lose to BJ Penn, that BJ Penn can have another title shot, right?
Yes. Yep.
Just seems logical that that's what they would want, right?
100%.
Do you think it was a mistake, by the way, that he tried going up weights again? Like, I understand in the early days where you could get away with it, but it seems a bit ridiculous. Like, surely you, like, walking around weight, you must have loads of weight on BJ Penn, right?
Yeah. I mean, the problem with that fight is because I was trying to go vegan. I was walking around at like 182.
Right.
Normally I walk around at 192. I was down 10 pounds of muscle. And I was like, I ended up hurting myself. I started having like neck issues that I still have today during that camp because I think I lost so much muscle mass, and I was just getting banged up more. And I think the soft tissue was probably weaker too from not eating animal fat.
Obviously, that's like a slightly touchy subject, but I'll just phrase it like this, right? I always say to people, the reason why I haven't looked into it super duper, like I know a bit about nutrition, but the reason why I've just assumed it's not a great diet for people who are athletes is athletes want to win. Like, guys, spoiler, athletes take steroids and cheat and do everything to win. Like, if going vegan was the secret, I think they'd all have done it by now. It wouldn't be like, you know, wouldn't be one guy who knew it. So I'd go the other way, dude. The only person I've ever heard of who was good, who was a vegan MMA fighter, was Jake Shields, right? It's the only one I can remember that even stands out. Were there even others?
If you remember, Jake got popped in Strikeforce.
That's true as well. Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I learned late was that I was researching it and I was looking up all these athletes and all these guys who were vegan and successful vegan athletes. They're all on some kind of performance enhancing drug. All of them. I think there wasn't a single one that I had learned or researched about who later didn't come out in some way that they were on.
Right. Makes sense. Right. Another thing that happened as well, this is another thing I've always found so sketchy about the way MMA works, because you're right. Like, I think the better way to describe it is you don't call it a sport. It's called prize fighting. It's all about getting fights that have a lot of money on them. That's basically the sport.
No, boxing is prize fighting. I don't think MMA is prize fighting. Today, it's promotional exhibitions.
Okay. Well, another thing that I think actually hurt you in your career as well is the timing of when you lost to Hendricks. He wasn't that big a figure in his career yet, but if you look later on, he became a continual contender. Like, that's not even that bad a loss to have on your record, dude.
No, at that time, there was legal TRT exemptions for MMA.
Oh yes, exactly. Yeah, this was exactly the era when people were huge,
when they made those legal TRT exemptions illegal, he couldn't use them anymore. His career fell off.
Yes,
and that was a fight that I shouldn't have fought. I was injured. I injured my MCL. I had like a second-degree tear in my MCL within the first week of my training camp. I couldn't walk. I couldn't wrestle. Sparring was very difficult for me to do, but I would not pull out. I refused to pull out because I had taken on, I bought a second home and I had a second mortgage and children on the way, a kid on the way. Or I think we had our first kid. And there was no way that I was going to lose everything if I didn't fight that fight. I couldn't just sit out and wait, for the next round. And you have that pressure because I know the promotion doesn't like me.
You think they would have fucked you if you pull out?
Yeah. So I'm like, they're going to screw me so bad if I pull out. It was the same situation with, then I lost that fight. I lost, the Hendricks fight quickly. 60, I was like, I need $60,000 or $60,000. I need the money. I should have swallowed my pride and asked for help from my parents or somebody else. I should have asked for some money and just sat out for a little bit. But I put it all on myself to do myself. Then after that fight, they set me up with the Eric Silva fight. And I knew that was okay, now we got him. Now we got Fitch. Now he's done. Right.
They thought this guy was going to knock you out, right?
Right.
Because I remember he's an exciting fighter.
So they had me go down. He was an exciting fighter. They call him the next GSP, the King of Rio. They had me fight him in Rio, right, in his home crowd.
Sure.
Right? I was like, okay.
I bet the whole crowd were just against you the whole time, right?
Oh, dude, it was like you go to the weigh-ins and it's like they have that chant. It's like you're gonna die,
yes,
whatever it is.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I had a Rocky IV moment though, because like leading up to that fight, you could make a movie out of this fight. 100%, you can make a movie out of this fight because I knew it. Like I was backwards against the wall. I just lost. The UFC wanted me out of there. They hated me. They had turned a lot of the fans against me. And I just knew it. I was like, this is it. This is the execution. They're setting me up for the execution to get rid of me and push me out forever. And man, did I kick it into overdrive for that. I started eating meat again. Like my training for that camp was amazing. Like it was Rocky IV training stuff for that fight, man. I went down there. I was just feeling great. And I called it before. It was like P Rose, or no, not P Rose, but Baby Ruth pointing to the center field, whatever, for his home run. Like I said, I was like, I'm gonna win this fight. It's gonna be a crazy fight, and it's gonna be fight of the night. And I'm gonna win that bonus. And we go into there, and it was a crazy fight. It was awesome, and the crowd loved it. And we were going into the third round. The crowd's going wild. And before they say go, I start waving my hands up, and the crowd's chanting Fitch. I was in Rio fighting the guy they called King of Rio, and the Brazilian crowd started chanting my name.
That's pretty cool.
That was one of the greatest moments of my life. You can't understand how amazing that was.
Right. When you had your fight against Demian Maia, right, this is another one where I feel like if someone's a casual fan, they're not going to understand this fight at all. Too. Like, this is one where, like, what I would say is this, as someone who knows a little bit about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's actually amazing that, like, you don't give anything up in this fight. Like, I know he's in, like, great positions and he's going for submissions all the time. You defend everything. You even, like, hadn't fought him very well. Like, this must have been a very tough fight, right?
I was so sick for that fight, I could not breathe. Like, I had no sprint capability. The week of that fight, I had a headache, and I just kind of chilled. I usually get into town and like on a Monday night or a Tuesday, and I'll do cardio that night. I took 2 days kind of off so just lay around to try to feel better. Thursday, I felt better. That was that night I started cutting weight. I went through the process, started losing a little bit of weight, get up the next day, cut the rest of the weight. I felt okay, felt like I'd gotten past whatever was bothering me. But then after we weighed in, I started rehydrate. And once I started to rehydrate, like I just started going, like I just could not breathe. It felt like, I had like pressure on my chest, like a gorilla was sitting on my chest. And it just got worse. I woke up the next morning and I was kind of panicked. I didn't know what to do. And, I was like, man, if I pull out of this, they're going to destroy my career. They're going to talk so much shit. They're going to make it impossible for me to ever fight anything ever again, So I was like, I have to do this. I was like, I can do it. Like somebody one punch starched Maia once. I was like, I can do this. I can stop his takedowns.
Okay.
I can beat him up on the feet. Like I can get through this. But man, in the back room warming up, like I had no energy. I couldn't do shit. And it was just, I was a zombie that whole fight. I was able to keep him from getting to positions to submit me, but like I couldn't pull the trigger to like make anything happen. And, they fired me as soon as they could after that fight. Or release me from my contract.
One thing I want to ask about is obviously it's rare that you can actually ask people who are behind the scenes in MMA, like how does the financial side work? So one thing I wanted to ask was, right, one thing they've always tried to say publicly about the UFC to make it not sound dodgy, that like the official on paper numbers for the smaller fighters is incredibly small, is they always make it sound like, basically the joke is, I mean, I know there actually was mafia people involved with the UFC, but they just make it sound like a good version of like, oh, don't worry, they all come in the back room and, like give out bonuses and people are getting taken. There's that phrase, taken care of, whatever that means, like give me a sense of like, are they like, if you're like a good draw, for example, do they actually pay people well? Are the people they fuck over? How would you say the UFC is structured?
It's not what they would make if they were independent and making percentages of the shows and cutting real deals. If they weren't in this monopoly, it's nowhere comparable. Like the money they get. It's better than a lot of these guys are poor. And, somebody like Daniel Cormier, he's made some public statements like, man, they paid me $3 million for a fight. It's the most money I've ever made. Well, that fight, it was one of the John Jones fights, I think. He probably should have made, if it was under boxing type rules, he probably would have made 15 million guaranteed up front. Sure. And then he would have had sponsors and pay-per-view points. And somebody who grew up poor, they have no concept of that. And it sounds like make-believe money. Whatever. Oh yeah, sure. Like they don't understand like the power of their name, because it's kind of this brainwashing almost. This what's that called when your captor, you become familiar with your captor?
Oh, Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome.
Yes.
It's kind of like a Stockholm syndrome. Like, oh, and they would never do that. They're taking care of me. They're doing so great for me. Like the only reason like we even know the stuff about how bad the finances are is because of first the sale when they sold when the Fertittas sold Zuffa to William Morris, WME. We got to look at it. We're like $4 billion. Holy crap! You've been telling us this promotion's broken. We're all in this together, bootstrapping to keep it alive. So that blew everybody away. And then the class action lawsuit we filed. That opened up a lot of people's eyes, because that was the only reason we got Discovery. It was the only reason we were allowed to get a lot of these finances. And the fact that they have it in their business plan to keep the pay below 20% to the athletes is mind-boggling, that they're able to do this crap. And people aren't outraged and the fighters aren't outraged. But yeah, the little bonuses and stuff in the back rooms, it's nothing compared to what they would make if they were actual free agents. Nothing. But it's hard to convince them. It's hard to convince a slave that they're a slave sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. By the way, along those lines, is it true that when they took away like the personal sponsorships and people just had to have like the Reebok gear and they couldn't have like all those patches, is it true that was a massive hit? I've heard some people could make really good money off that, right?
Yeah, like I would say I made as much in sponsorship as I was getting paid for my show money. Right. Generally, the fights work as you get show money and a win bonus. But I would make easily. I would make in sponsorships what I made for my show money. If I was going to get paid 40,000 and 40,000, I would make probably about 40,000 in sponsorships. And that was, they started attacking that earlier. Around 2008, 2009, they started taxing the sponsors. So you had to pay them $50,000 to $100,000 to sponsor a fighter. So like if you were a small mom and pop shop who just had a budget to be able to sponsor 2 or 3 fighters a year during their fights, that wiped you out. It put you out of business.
Sounds like the UFC must have been making a killing just off that part, mate.
They decimated a bunch of small businesses because they couldn't get eyeballs on their products anymore. So they just went belly up and couldn't do it anymore. And then they came in like, oh, we're saving the day because there's not enough sponsors for people. When, you had guys like Mighty Mouse, he had an Xbox sponsorship. They stole that from him. They're like, hey, Xbox, why are you paying this guy that money? You could pay us this money and get everybody. We'll put your logo on the mat. You don't have to pay him. It's like, I don't know, man. It's dirty pool, dirty business. They purposely structure things to keep guys hungry. They want to starve you, because when you're starved and you don't have enough money to feed yourself, you'll sign any shitty contract.
Is it that much different with the other orgs? Like, obviously, the perception of people like Bellator is they pay more money because they have to get the big name,
when you
right?
have a monopoly in an industry, everyone else in the industry has to copy that monopoly. Otherwise, they're going out of business. They either have to copy it or they have to be more corrupt,
right,
than that monopoly.
Yes,
and that's a business thing that people know in monopolies. That's just what happens.
Sure,
you can't come in and be like, "Oh, I'm going to play things straight and narrow and I'm going to make things work this way." No, you'll get destroyed. You'll never make a dollar. So all of the contracts you see in MMA today are all copies of what the UFC is doing.
Right. When you went to the World Series of Fighting, you fought against, I would call him the notorious Palhares, because this was the guy where everyone knows he was amazing at like heel hooks, etc. And everything he went for was some sort of leg submission, and he got you in a knee bar. Right. One thing I would ask is this, dude, I think you're brave to even take that fight, because I've heard a lot of stories of fighters who just turned that down behind the scenes and said, like, because if people don't know, I've only ever done a few sessions of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where you do things like heel hooks. If people don't know, they don't even let you do that full speed in like practice, because you could just rip your whole knee up. It's so easy. So, and I've heard that guy was ridiculous. Like, wasn't he the guy who just would like keep hold of it?
Notorious for not letting him go, cranking him extra and whatever.
Was it a concern coming in?
What's that?
Did you worry about it coming in? Like he's going to go for that?
Oh yeah, of course. But the thing was, he was the champ. He was the champ at the time, and there was no other way to win the belt other than to fight him. So around that time was also the time I started learning about the TRT stuff and how bad it was, because I didn't know, because it sounded like for a while it just was the older guys. I thought it was like the Hendersons and the guys who were late 30s, 40-year-old fighters. So I didn't care as much. But then I started realizing that, oh wow, the guys who are 22 are figuring out ways to fake their testosterone tests, so doctors would prescribe them testosterone.
Just became a loophole, right?
Or they get a dirty doctor. Yeah, it became a loophole that guys took advantage of. So you had younger guys who were younger than me who were on testosterone, and I started finding out about a lot of guys who I respected were on juice. They were taking juice. They're taking testosterone, and it kind of blew my mind. And I was like, man, why am I playing things straight and narrow and making so much less money than these guys? So for that fight, I juiced up. I did it wrong. I didn't know what I was doing, and I got caught. I lost the fight, and I got suspended. Total embarrassment. The most embarrassing thing I've done in my life. But yeah, I felt like I was backed into a corner, and I'm not trying to justify it in any way, but it was just kind of like, I was realizing that I was in an ugly business, and it wasn't the respectful, honorable thing that I thought it was. And I chose the wrong direction.
By the way, another guy that you fought in WSOF that I want to ask about is a guy I think had a similar career to you, dude, which has got to be Yushin Okami. This is another guy that was really good in the UFC, but the UFC clearly just wanted him to get the fuck out, right? They thought he was boring.
Yeah, like he didn't. Well, he never learned to speak English, so he had a harder time connecting with the U.S. fans. He didn't have what they call the it factor or whatever. It didn't matter if he was big and strong and won fights. Like, they only care. Like, this is the thing, right? Your promoter in prize fighting is supposed to promote the athlete. They're supposed to make sure everybody knows who you are. But things in MMA work backwards. The MMA promoters use a fighter's name to promote the promotion. So if you don't have a name, if you don't put yourself out there in a way to create a buzz, they don't want to use you. Whereas in boxing, a boxing promoter will invest in an athlete that he thinks is going to be a champ. And he'll spend money on trainers, coaches, apartments. He'll take care of that guy and build him up, make sure everybody knows who he is, and get him to those title fights. Because then they get a huge return back when he starts winning those big fights. The exact opposite happens in MMA because of the way the structure is, where there's no free agency. So they take a guy who's got a big name, they take a guy who's hot, and they stick him out there in order to draw people into their promotion and sell their promotion. And they're not going to take care of that guy to like make sure he has a long career. They just need that buzz for right now. And the second you don't have that buzz anymore, they'll push you aside.
Oh, absolutely. One thing I also thought was actually quite cool about the part of your career when you weren't in the UFC was you were, because if people don't know, in those other what do you call them, promotions, what they usually do is they're able to get other big names who also have been like pushed up by the UFC or used to be champions, etc. So one thing that was quite cool is you got to basically like round your resume out. You fought a whole load of other people who also were some of the best in your weight class, and fights that should have happened in the UFC, right? People like Jake Shields, Okami, Paul Daly, Rory MacDonald. All these guys were top UFC fighters at one point, right?
Yeah, and that was another one of the screw jobs that the UFC did. Is there was a lot of big name fighters that I could have fought. Like after I fought GSP, you notice like I didn't fight another big name guy until Thiago Alves.
Yes.
And then I got fought BJ Penn. So like they had me fight guys with no names that were hard to finish, the guys that they wanted me to lose to, guys that they wanted me to underperform against because they were trying to get rid of me.
Yes.
That was a strategy that kind of Joe Silva came up with. He's going to make the fighters, the wrestling, grappling based fighters fight each other so that they knock each other off.
Right.
And they can keep pushing the strikers.
Yes. I mean, along those lines, you said it earlier, if this was like a real sport and the rankings meant anything, then if you're number 3, by default, you have to fight number 2 and number 1. That would just be the way a sport would work, right?
Yep.
But the difference in the UFC, as you're saying, is like another thing I think is really underrated, dude, is like because of how much variance there is in MMA, like anyone in theory could get flash knockout or some crazy like fluke submission could happen out of nowhere. They know if they put you in enough fights, eventually you're going to lose, right? Even if these are not good fights, they know if they put you in 10 fights, you're going to lose one eventually.
Because especially with those small gloves, like not the best fighter doesn't always win with the small gloves because there's so many different ways to get hit and hurt. In boxing, the better fighter usually wins.
Sure.
Usually. There's not too many fights where it's a lucky punch knockout. They got bigger gloves. They can take more damage. They have the sustaining 8 count, so you might get knocked down once with a lucky punch, but you get back up and the fight continues. So that kind of gives them a big advantage too, because the way the promotional agreements work in MMA is if you lose, they can drop you. They can drop you from your promotional agreement. You're not safe unless you win. And if you're asking for too much money or they don't like the deal or they want to put you in your place for a little bit, they'll cut you and make you go somewhere else.
Sure. By the way, what did you actually think? Because one of your last really big fights was obviously the Rory MacDonald fight. What did you think of this fight? Because he's another person who, could have done so much more in his career, right? Yeah.
I got robbed. I won that fight. Hands down. Every time I watch it, I won 4, maybe 5 rounds. I really do not see where these yahoos can possibly say that I lost to him in any way. That was a heartbreaker. And that fight really made me want to retire. I was going to retire, but then I decided to fight one more, just because, I didn't want to leave the last fight as a draw. And I thought Neiman Gracie was a great last fight. If I beat him, they give me a title shot, right? If I don't beat him, I pass the torch to somebody who's probably going to fight for the title soon. He's hit a couple skids since then, but I really wasn't into that fight, that last one.
Was it just incompetence in the judging, or do you think that were there elements that wanted him to win the fight, basically?
I think incompetence in the judging, but also those elements that wanted him to win.
Like he was their golden boy right in the promotion, right?
He was the golden boy. He was getting pushed hard. And again, these don't have to be like direct, planned like things. Judges are people. Judges are people just like anybody else. And they get swayed by the hype trains. They get swayed by the people around them. They get swayed by people, saying ooh and ah and whatever. And if they're sitting next to the announcers, if you listen to the announcing of that fight and you listen to the fight without the announcers, have a friend sit and watch that fight without listening to any of the announcers and let them score the fight. And then have them sit and watch with the announcers on.
Yes.
Right? Completely different perspective because everything he did was amazing. And, oh, he hurt me so bad. And, oh, my God, look at that. Everything I did was like, ho-hum. Oh, well, whatever. It's like, that was one of those fights where he was holding on and trying to get stood up. And it was very frustrating. It was a couple times where he was just tying me up and holding my head when I was up on top in the fence, trying to beat him up. And he was just trying to stop the fight to get stood up. And it's frustrating. It's very frustrating. But yeah, it's not a direct screw job, but I still got screwed.
If you'd won that fight, you think you would still be fighting now?
Man, it's a possibility, because that would have been my fight. I would have gone into it was a tournament for the $1 million prize. You know, like I had one more fight against another striker who doesn't have good wrestling defense, Lima. And I would have fought Lima in the finals for $1 million. Yeah, I think I would have beat that guy. I'm pretty sure I would have won that fight. And then from there, you know, like I had it in my mind to win that tournament and retire, honestly. I thought that would have been great. Take the $1 million, start all new business, and continue with my life outside the madness of MMA.
When you were able to be in like the champion of WSOF and be in these Bellator title fight type scenarios, or the Grand Prix, as you say, right? How much should a fan actually weigh those up? Like I say, there's a lot of very good fighters in these divisions. They're maybe not as famous, or they're people from the past. Like, how do you evaluate that versus the UFC? Do people put too much stock in the UFC?
Well, yeah. Honestly, yeah. Because there are great fighters, and without independent rankings, we have no idea who's the best, honestly.
It's true. Yeah.
Like the perception is it's the UFC. And 10 years ago, that was true, because they bought all the top guys. When they bought Pride, when they bought Strikeforce, they bought the fighters. They bought the belts. They bought everybody. But it's been 10 years, and a lot of those top guys washed out. So now all you're seeing is controlled rankings through the UFC. And we just saw Piera and Izzy fight. And we're talking a guy who it was his 7th MMA fight.
Something like that, yes.
4th UFC fight. And he wins that fight like that. That makes me question their whole ranking system. Like, do they have the top guys in their weight class? Or is it just the perception because they have the most power, they make the most money? I mean, they make so much more money than all the other promotions. The next two promotions, right? I think Bellator and ONE FC. Them combined, their revenues combined is 1/10 of what the UFC makes.
Sure. By the way, along those lines as well,
not competing.
The other thing I will say as well is I noticed the UFC are really convenient about, like, if someone's doing well in another promotion, like they pretend you don't exist, but then when they're going to bring you into the UFC, they spin it around until you're the best guy ever. Like, the best example I would give is this, mate. I used to watch Michael Chandler fight in Bellator like fucking 10 years ago. Like, he should have been in years ago after those Eddie Alvarez fights. The joke is he comes to the UFC now he's at like the end of his career, if anything. He's had all those great fights, but now they can pretend he's like the hot new shit. And he looks like, dude, that train came in years ago.
You're not wrong, 100%. And they didn't give him, he was a champ there, and they didn't give him an immediate title shot. No,
exactly.
Like because they don't want to tarnish that. They don't want that image to be tarnished in any way. They don't want somebody from another organization coming in and taking the belt right away from being a champ somewhere else, because then people might question their supremacy.
By the way, when you did that lawsuit against them, was there like a vibe within the industry of like, your career's over if you do this, like you're going to be blackballed forever? Like, did people try to tell you that?
I mean, I knew what I was doing. I am a little bit shocked at how soft and they're pussies. Honestly, they're pussies. How much pussies most of these fighters really are. It's really, I've lost a lot of respect for the industry and these athletes, because you're supposed to be tough guys. Like me watching somebody do a fight promo acting like I'm the biggest, baddest man in the world, but I bend down on my knees and suck Dana off. It's pathetic. It's pathetic to me. It blows my mind that they will do that. I do not understand. Like, these guys, you look at the numbers. If you're making millions of dollars, just hire an economist. Hire somebody who can crunch numbers and look at the stuff and tell you a solid answer, so you don't have to look it up yourself or whatever. Like, they're stealing from you. They are robbing you, especially the guys at the top. They're having the most amount of money taken from them, and they're okay with it, but they still want to act like tough guys. I don't understand that at all. One
thing I wanted to ask you about was, in your career, you actually had as much as people will remember like ups and downs, you didn't have many losses, dude. You only had 8 losses in your whole career. And I looked over like a 15-year span of time, you went
18.
20 wins and you lost 6 times. That was just like from the UFC onwards. So like you won an absurd amount of fights in your weight class.
32 wins, 8 losses, 2 draws, and 1 no contest.
There you go. Do you think people have a skewed perception on your career? I mean, that like on paper, that's like a Hall of Fame career instantly, right?
It should be, but like they'll never give it to me because Dana White said I was boring once. Like the funniest thing, all right, like nobody ever said anything about being boring ever until the second Thiago Alves fight. It was the lead up to the second Thiago Alves fight. And that was, and they're the ones who put it out there. It was their press and them telling their press what questions to ask. Because my career was not much different than GSP's as far as finish ratios and performance and excitement. It was not until they started pushing that stuff that people started calling me boring. And like the majority of people who say it today have never even seen one of my fights. They just heard Dana White say it once.
Yes. I would actually say as well, because you were making me think about it then when you were describing how go on.
I've had 2 fight of the night performances and I've headlined multiple cards, even after the UFC calling me boring. Like they call me boring and then I'm headlining with BJ Penn. Why? Why would that happen if they don't think I'm going to draw money?
Sure.
If I'm not going to bring eyeballs to it, they wouldn't do that. They put me on the undercard. They put me low on the main card. I've had WSOF then pushes me and I'm the headliner multiple times. How does that work out? How does that play out? These guys are there to make money. If nobody wants to watch me fight, if I'm boring, there's no way they would ever put me in the main event.
Yes.
But multiple times, over and over again, main event, co-main event. They're telling you lies. It's really frustrating, man. People I wish were smarter.
Like you said earlier, in MMA, the way the promoter promotes the fighter is very different to other sports. I'll give you the example. I don't know that much about boxing, but because I mainly watched MMA for all these years, dude, I was shocked when I went to watch some of those Floyd Mayweather fights where he's the promoter and the fighter.
Yes.
And the joke is he's hyping up the guy that he thinks he's going to beat as like an awesome fighter because he wants you to watch the fight. I remember thinking, dude, this is really different in the UFC.
Look at this guy. He's awesome. Like I follow Mayweather Productions or his stuff on Instagram and like it's always positive. This guy's amazing. This guy's awesome. These guys are going to be the next stars. They're not like, oh, he's a bum. He won't take this fight. He's asking for too much money. Like that only happens in MMA and pro wrestling. That only happens in those 2 productions.
Yes.
Like follow the trail, guys. There's a breadcrumb trail showing you what's up, what's going on.
By the way, is there so? Like I said, you got a lot of the good names of your era and your peers and your weight class. Are there any specific names you never got to fight that you wish could have happened at some key point in time?
Nick Diaz, Carlos Condit,
yes.
Martin Kapman. Man, who else? I'm forgetting his name, but he's a stand-up Muay Thai fighter. But there's a ton of guys that I could have fought and they never had me fight. Instead, they had me fight Mike Pierce, who's a super tough guy it was a great fight. But nobody knew who he was. Nobody had heard of him before. So the fact that I didn't knock him out in 30 seconds, I sucked.
Sure.
I fought Paulo, I'm sorry, forgetting his name right now, but he knocked out Koscheck and they had me, it was his first fight. Then they had me fight him his second fight at UFC 100. Like nobody ever heard of that guy either.
Yes.
Then they had me fight that guy. I fought Ben Saunders as a replacement fight last minute because Thiago failed a brain test or whatever for his medical testing. And, I had to go from fighting short Thiago Alves to a tall left-handed guy in like 2 days to prepare for it. I got no credit for that. Oh, you didn't finish him though. Get out of here. Hey, just such stories. Dan Hardy, I could have fought. Yeah, there's a lot of guys that would have been bigger names, bigger draws to fight, but they weren't going to give them to me.
Funny thing is, of the names you're mentioning, dude, I think Carlos Condit would be an amazing fight between you two. I mean, he's also obviously he's a guy who can fight off the ground, etc. He's got an all-round skill set. It would be a great fight.
Would have been good to fight. I was asking for Carl Parisian back in the day before I had any big fights.
Classic one, yeah. Judo guy.
He kind of fell off, There's a number of them. I was really surprised when they gave me Diego Sanchez. I think they thought I was going to lose that fight.
So you mean when you would actually ask fights, you were asking for exciting ones and ones that were different styles and stuff,
like,
right?
why aren't I fighting these people? Why can't I get these guys?
Yes.
And then my manager, Crazy Bob, would shake his head and be like, well, they don't want you to ruin that guy's hype right now.
By the way, another thing that must be weird from your perspective and your background in martial arts is it's specifically wrestling that they're fucking with the guys who are like, I mean, people might not know this, but like people, even like the Conor McGregors of the world, when they were at the top, they clearly protected these guys from fighting the wrong type of wrestler at the wrong moment because they know they'd lose, right?
Yep, 100%. And part of that is because of they don't want fighters to have any leverage. And the only way you get any kind of leverage in the sport of MMA is to win and not lose. That's it. Like Khabib had leverage because he didn't lose. That's the only reason. Because you have no leverage. You have no ability to ask for anything. Because they have all the power.
By the way, what is your take? Because obviously you fought against GSP, you've watched Khabib. If those two had ever actually fought, how do you think it would go?
They're different weight classes. But I think Khabib could win that fight if he beefed up to 170. I think he could.
Are you an admirer of his style?
He's too good of a wrestler for GSP's timing to do something to him. And if he gets on top, I don't think GSP would be able to get away.
Obviously, you're just watching it. You haven't like directly felt it yourself, but is there something unique about how Khabib wrestles? I mean, people have seen like the classic one to me is like that moment when he was fighting Dustin Poirier, and Poirier himself is just like, I just can't get him off me. It's like, dude, that sounded terrifying.
Yeah, no, it's his pressure. He's got unbelievable pressure on top. You're being crushed. I would come in when he had big fights coming up. I would come in to help out, and I would grapple with him on the ground, and I would go down on bottom, and it was my job to like get away. And like I would get away 1 to 2 times in that 5-minute round. It was exhausting. It was exhausting.
What's different about that, by the way, from other wrestlers? Because I've heard it's not like he's just stronger. It's like you're saying, it's like a pressure technique, right?
He's strong, but he has positional strength too. He knows where to put the leverage to keep you down. And I give a lot of credit. I have a podcast I do on. I shoot a live stream podcast I shoot on Sunday nights called Jon Fitch Knows Nothing. And that was what I talked about this last weekend, because there was another Usman Nurmagomedov won the lightweight title at Bellator. And I was talking about, these Dagestanis and how I've been saying for a long time how good they are. And one of the things with them is they have a combat sambo background, right? They didn't start off in wrestling. They didn't start off in karate. They didn't start off in some other discipline and they get to 20 years old and then start mixed martial arts training. They started in combat sambo, and combat sambo is basically MMA. It's in an open mat. They wear a gi top, shorts. They have headgear, bigger gloves, and shin pads. But it's MMA, and they train that from them as a youth. So they're developing not just wrestling skills, but they're developing wrestling skills particularly for fighting, right? So they're honed in at a very young age. And even though they have vastly different styles, Usman versus Islam Makhachev versus Khabib, 3 very distinct different styles of fighting, but they're all very good.
Yes.
And I think a lot of it is due to that combat sambo background.
Do you find it as a wrestler though? Like it sounds like that aspect of the fact that in your sport they kind of like disrespect that discipline. They kind of make it like wrestling's boring. It's not the one people want to watch. People want to watch like that must suck, right? Does it make it a bit bitter towards MMA as a sport?
It's such a lie too. It's such a lie, because if you go to some of these countries where wrestling is a big deal and they don't try to poo-poo it, there's huge stadiums that people go and watch wrestling. There's huge stadiums in Russia and Dagestan and places where people will go 10, 20,000 people to watch wrestling matches. Bull crap. Absolute bull crap. I believe it's part of the emasculation of Western nations that they push that wrestling's gay and it's not real fighting or whatever, honestly, because the strength that your youth will develop by learning how to wrestle is a threat to tyranny. That's my God honest opinion on that situation. Because you go to Iran, go to Russia, go to Turkey, go to these places who like respect wrestling and show up in droves to watch wrestling. Like, they're very masculine nations.
Sure. By the way, I saw that this is actually the thing that originally made me think about asking an interview. I saw you did a ebook that was about how to do weight cuts, right? Which is obviously like I alluded to.
Bible.
Yeah, like I said at the beginning of the interview, that's essentially something I was shocked to find this out. But even all levels of wrestling, it's all about weight cuts, right? Here's the thing I would ask. I've got a couple of beginner questions that you can give me your take on. Obviously, if people want more information, go read the book, right? The first thing I would ask is this. You know that classic thing people always say of like, why doesn't everyone just agree to fight at their weight class so you don't need to do weight cuts? And then, there's no downsides. Then, like, people aren't dehydrated or they don't fuck it up and have health problems. Is there a reason that, like, what's the simple explanation as to why everyone can't just not weight cut, basically?
Because it's impossible to regulate. I think it's impossible to regulate. Some way, somehow, guys are going to figure out a way to be as light as possible, but as strong as possible. They try to do this with jiu-jitsu tournaments by weighing on the scale, like right on the mat. But you're still going to have some guys who are able to lean out and lose fat, and you have a much lower body fat percentage for that competition, and that's going to give them a slight advantage. You have to be able to do the brackets. You have to be able to do the matchups. The promoters themselves want to do the square off weigh-ins and all that stuff. And those are usually done the day before. They're done prior, earlier. And I just don't know if there's really a way or successful way to be able to monitor that. So I think it's better to allow the weight cutting, but make sure everybody knows how to do it right. Because a lot of guys just try to lose a bunch of water weight. And it's not. If you read my book, Weight Cut Bible, it's mostly diet and nutrition for the 8 to 12 weeks leading up to the fight. And then at the last little bit, the last couple days is going to be water loss.
Yes. I mean, if people don't know, you never missed weight a single time in your career, right?
The first Thiago Alves fight, I missed the first time, and then I made weight within the hour after that.
Okay. Because one thing I know that you were talking about when I saw some of the media around this book is, like, as you say, people make it sound like it's still such like a roll of the dice. Like, oh, he was just unlucky, or, he just ate the wrong thing the night before. Like, if you do the science of it right, you can do it every time, right? It's like, it's a discipline.
It's not easy, but it's totally doable. But you have to have some discipline. And it's really a part of discipline and being tough enough to lose off that little bit of water weight and not eat the bad food for that, 6 to 12 weeks of training. And that's usually where the breakdowns happen. People just are not disciplined with their eating.
Have you ever been in one of those, like, ones where you did fuck something up and you had to, like, go really hard at the end to make the cut?
Well, the Thiago Alves one, I came in kind of heavy and I don't know what I ate or something, but like the last couple pounds made it really difficult to lose.
If someone's a total casual, they've never experienced weight cutting at all, right? People will have seen on those like UFC things. Yeah, don't worry about that, mate. We're almost done. People will have seen on those UFC things, like when the coaches like force the person to like do the extra sweat and be in the shower thing, right? How would you explain mentally? Like, what is the mental battle the person's going through? It sounds like that's the bigger issue, right?
You just want to get the F out of there. You don't care. Like, it sucks. You don't want to do it anymore. When you have that last little bit to go, and if you don't have a good support system around you, like, it can be absolutely terrible to try to get through, because it's just like, yeah, it's awful, man. It doesn't feel good. It's the fight before the fight.
Right. The last thing I would ask you, because you touched on this earlier, and I've noticed if people watch your YouTube or any of your podcasts, you actually go a little bit more philosophical, as much as people might not assume a UFC fight would think that way. So my question would be this. You've hinted at it, but as a final message, maybe you could give me your thoughts on, like, it sounds like to you, things like wrestling, discipline, sport, these are actually like building blocks that essentially we can fix like humanity with, right?
Yes. Facing adversity, forcing yourself to face adversity on a regular basis is something that's going to build you up and make you a stronger person. When you've been through a hard wrestling practice, hard wrestling season. You've been put in bad positions over and over and over again through the day. You go to jiu-jitsu class 5 days a week. You have to fight out of mounts. You have to fight chokes off. You have to fight, leg chokes off where you're getting teabagged pretty much and unconscious at the same time. You've been put in these bad situations and you fight out of them. It makes a lot of the other crap going on in your life less stressful. It turns the noise down. I did an interview with Ed Lattimore once, and he talked about how learning how to box, learning how to be a fighter, turn the noise down. He grew up in a rough area, rough neighborhood, and there was a lot of stressful stuff going on in the street, drug addicts, drug dealers, crime, and learning how to fight made it easier to deal with all the other horseshit going on around you.